Welcome to Mindshift. I'm Brandon, and today is episode 2 of our newest series, A Secular Bible Study. In addition to already changing the name, I have also narrowed down our agenda from 10 bullet points to 7. There was some overlap, and I think this will make for a much more concise episode. Also a good time to note that these episodes won't be standardized in terms of their length. Some books will require more, and some will require less. Nonetheless, my goal for this series is very simple. I'll state it quickly, and then we will dive in. I want this to be a secular look at the historic collection of these 66 books of the canonized Protestant Bible. I want to help separate what is myth, what is theology, what is history, what is actual, what is not, etc. So without further ado, let's get into Exodus, and point 1 is that of a book overview. So where did we leave off in Genesis? We left off with Joseph in Egypt, and sure enough, Exodus' story picks up in Egypt, but this time it is with God's people being slaves in Egypt. Exodus 12:40 tells us that the Israelites were in captivity in Egypt for 430 years. In terms of a number of how big this people group was, that is debated amongst scholars, and I'm not even going to list a number here because there are so many different claims that are so wide-ranging from one another. But what the Bible does say is that this group of individuals was prospering like crazy. They were filling the land so much to the point that the new Pharaoh was concerned about the numbers of these individuals. The narrative really begins with the introduction of Moses. Moses is going to be our featured lead for this story. In addition to Moses, the other main characters, of course, are going to be Pharaoh, his siblings Miriam and Aaron, his right-hand man Joshua, which will take a more prominent role in the books to come, and the people themselves, the Israelite nation. After all, this story is a continuation of God's first covenant, and that first covenant we saw in Genesis with Abraham, that he would bless Abraham's descendants by making them a great nation, that they would inherit the land of Canaan, and that they would be a blessing to all nations. I think that last one is a little bit controversial, because if you're going to get point 2 where you inherit Canaan, you're definitely not going to be a blessing to the Canaanites, yet alone a whole host of other things that we're going to see throughout the rest of the Pentateuch. But what we're going to get in this story is a continuation of that Abrahamic covenant, or really a redoing already of a new covenant with Moses, establishing Moses as a leader and giving law. So in addition to the Exodus itself from Egypt, the wandering in the desert, the many miracles that happen, we do reach the law where Moses is given the 10 commandments at Mount Sinai. And then the end of Exodus is really focused on the tabernacle, which I think is something that maybe a lot of Christians don't know much about, and probably a lot of non-believers know little to nothing about. But it's an extremely important part of this book, and it has a lot of far-reaching implications into God's character and God's connection to his chosen people. Long story short, this is the origin story of the Israelite nation. We had a prequel in Genesis that was paving a way, but this is that actual birth of the nation. So let's dive into point 2, authorship and date. Now here we might be a little more brief because I handled this in a lot of detail in the Genesis video. So if you haven't watched the Genesis one yet, watch this. And my point 2 there will explain the huge difference between the potential that Moses wrote this book and all the divine inspiration that would require, the ability for him to foretell his own death, and a much more supernatural presence in general to get this word. And this is what a vast majority of Christians still believe even to this day. And the top scholarly opinion, which is that this is the documentary hypothesis, and it includes the Yahwist, the Elohist, the priestly, and the Deuteronomical, I can never say that word correctly, sources, those 4 sources combined to give us these first 5 books of the Bible. So you're going to hear me repeat this for Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. So I won't get into all those details again, but most people believe if there is any shred of truth to these stories, that they happened between the 15th and 13th century BCE. That would be the time frame that we are looking at as we discuss these events. The big question is how mythological and how practical are these events? And do we have any outside knowledge other than the Bible itself to help us fill in these gaps or even believe in them in the first place? We'll be getting to that in future points. And that will bring us to point 3, which is historical background and accuracy. This point gets a little bit tricky, and I'm trying to be as objective as possible. But what we're left with is a lack of evidence. We know quite a bit about ancient Egypt as the Egypt that is suggested to be around during this time period. We know, of course, that they used slave labor. We know that they had pharaohs as rulers and how those pharaohs were viewed. We know what land they occupied and at what time and how they governed that ownership and leading of those different portions of land. But what we don't have is any physical evidence linking the Israelite nation in captivity in Egypt in any numbers, yet alone very large numbers, for any amount of time, yet alone 430 years. Now, if you want to continue down the rabbit hole of atheist explanations here, Holy Kool-Aid has an amazing series, Nothing Fails Like Bible History, and he does one on the Exodus, and I'd encourage you to watch it, and I will link it below. He can explain a lot of those points and a lot of what archaeologists are talking about better than I can. I'm here to give you the overview, and the overview is that a lack of evidence. Now, a lack of evidence or no evidence does not suggest entirely that this account is made up. It also doesn't verify it in any way, shape, or form. It seems unlikely, though, that a nation as strong and powerful and dominant as Egypt, that was as good with their record keeping as they were, just left out what would have been their largest workforce and then lack of that workforce. Like, what happened to Egypt after losing all of those Israelites? What happened after losing their pharaoh supposedly and all of his greatest men and warriors in the Red Sea? Where is the account from an ancient Egyptian perspective of when all the firstborn sons died, or any of the other plagues that bestowed them? This would have been epic. It would have been the first thing to be recorded, and we have zilch outside of the Bible. That seems highly problematic. So in response to this lack of evidence, we get something very similar that happened in Genesis as we continue to learn more about our scientific world and how it doesn't align with Genesis, and that's moving the goalpost of how literal we are taking it. And just like a large portion of progressive Christians don't believe in a 6-day creation story, or even a young earth theory for that matter, a large portion of believers and scholars are now looking at the Exodus as something more symbolic, viewing Exodus as a story that reflects the collective memory of these people, their identity and formation and religious beliefs. It could be as simple that there was just a really small scale group that slowly moved through Egypt and had some kind of an integration with the indigenous Canaanite group. And over time, the lore and myth of creating this Israelites in Canaan became the story of the Exodus. History is strange. Stories get spun. I'm sure there are seeds of truth here. It's just yet to be determined how big those seeds are and how much truth they contain. So let's move on to point 4, which is that of literary analysis. The book of Exodus belongs to the genre of ancient Near Eastern narrative. This style combines historical events with theological import, adding in religious and legal material. In this particular case, its point was to show the concept in its entirety from the Exodus, the leaving, the becoming free for the Israelite people, all the way to their liberation. In terms of structure here, Exodus can really be divided into 3 portions, kind of a beginning, middle, and end. The beginning is really just setting the stage. Where are the Israelites? What is going on with them? This is the captivity part. This is the necessary setup for a freedom tale, for a liberation tale. We get the introduction of our central character, Moses, his importance, his narrative, his strengths and weaknesses, so we can better appreciate his arc to come. Part 2 is the forging of this chosen people group, with the pinnacle being receiving the 10 commandments, receiving the covenant, receiving the law, organizing themselves as a people group, with a strong emphasis on moral and ethical conduct, which is a theme that pretty much keeps up all the way through until the Gospels with the sacrifice of Jesus. And the ending, the third part of Exodus, is again about the construction of the tabernacle. So we've left slavery. We are in the wilderness. We've received the law and a new covenant, but how do we have relation with this God? The tabernacle. What are God's rules in association with him communing with man? What is this going to look like now, and what is it pointing to looking like in the future? Throughout those 3 different sections, we see a few literary techniques employed. The first one being vivid imagery. We see this especially as the 10 plagues of Egypt are described. The writers seem to really want to get across the magnitude of God's divinity. We also see softer literary techniques like that of a poetic sense in something like the Song of Moses, which is Exodus 15, 1-8, and this is his victory cry essentially after crossing the Red Sea. Furthermore, we have a huge focus on legal. Now, I don't know if you would count this as its own literary technique, but listing out and conveying the laws, the consequences of breaking those laws, and the importance of these laws is a huge part of the Exodus story, and this legalistic nature is something that we do see in other ancient texts that are similar in scope. So, all of this put together gives us a really rich tapestry of storytelling that is the Exodus narrative. For now, let's go straight into point 5, main themes. Now, just like Genesis, this is a book that is packed with meaning. Any story told on this kind of a scale that covers this much ground in this short of a time frame is going to be ripe for theme. We could make a case for so many different themes and motifs, but I'm going to list 4 that I think are very prominent in this book. The first one is going to be some sort of divine providence or divine guidance. We saw this in Genesis, we didn't focus on it very much, and we see it big time here in Exodus, and it's important to point out because we lose it. After Jesus' ascension, the idea of a corporeal God almost completely disappears. We are told to rely on faith. We are told to commune via the Holy Spirit on a personal level. But this is not how it always was. Yahweh, in his introduction to us in Genesis and continued here in the second book of the Bible through Exodus, is a very hands-on God. He intervenes on their behalf. He guides them through various challenges. Every single day is yet another miracle with Yahweh. Examples of this start when they're in captivity with the miracles of the plagues. Miracles if you're an Israelite, not so miraculous if you're an Egyptian. And then the parting of the Red Sea, everyone's favorite miracle. But it gets better. God continues to show up even more. He feeds them personally by raining down food from the sky. He uses a pillar of cloud in the day that is always visible and a pillar of fire at night that is always visible to physically lead them through the wilderness. He meets with Moses on the mountain. And in some reports, you're getting that Moses saw him, and some that he didn't see him, and some that he saw him only from the back as he was passing by, and some that he spoke face to face with him. Either way, you had a very intimate connection between God and Moses that at the very least was auditory, so that Moses could hear the 10 Commandments he needed to inscribe. And that happened on multiple occasions. I won't even get into the 3 different versions of the 10 Commandments at this point. So let's go with divine intervention, because that is what God was doing. He intervened on the free will of the Egyptians to release the Israelites, and then he intervened on a daily basis within the Israelite community to establish them as a nation. Theme 2 would be that of identity and community. This one, if you get rid of all the mythology and theology in it, is actually pretty cool. It's a people group at their beginning. It's kind of like that game you would play in history class where it's like, oh, if I was on an island with this many people and I had to create my own government, what would it look like? We see this played out in a grand scale. We see how Moses goes about creating law and order. Again, all facilitated under God's specific command. But Moses, as an example of a leader, is something that is fascinating. The people that he chose to surround himself with, the way that he ran his councils, how he divvied up those who reported to him and what their jobs were in leading their groups of people in this trickle-down effect so that Moses as a single leader could have a far and impactful reach amongst the whole group. He was also judged during this time. Everyone brought their problems to Moses. On a daily basis, it was his job to impose the law, rule on it, and give the consequences for it to these people. This is a huge undertaking. And in doing so, we see the formation of a new group of people, a new group with morals and ethics and laws and a hierarchy of values to themselves. Again, according to the narrative itself, this is a very divinely inspired morality, but from an objective view looking in, this is the development of a people group and a culture. And I think that's pretty interesting. Third, and similar, would be that of ethics and social justice. Again, at looking in the law, we get a deep idea in whether you believe it was God-given or man-given, the morality or justice or value system of either this God or this people group. We see laws on everything. Legality is around owning property, labor practices, family relations, treatment of insiders, treatment of outsiders, etc. What we'll see very clearly is that the Israelites had a set of laws that were for them and how they treated their own, and a pretty different set of laws on how they treated those around them in their neighboring or enemy nations. And then a fourth and last theme that I would give you is that of power and or oppression. And I say this because Exodus has been used so much since its original account as a liberation tale for other groups that are oppressed. To me, in my personal view, I see it as almost a sick irony when you look at the slaves that were part of the transatlantic slave movement and you see them looking to Exodus as the eventuality of their people being freed, when within that same book we see law after law, rule after rule about the express permission from this God to his chosen people to make slaves of other nations. So yes, by this time in America, the Bible was being used as both an excuse for owning slaves from another nation and a moral guideline as to why we might not want to do slavery anymore. And people love to point to that second part, but they really hate to look at the first part. But ironic or not, this has been a liberation tale for many, a story of powerlessness, of oppression, and of pulling yourself up or having divine intervention to remove you out of those circumstances and empower you or your people to a greater calling. That is the story of the Exodus. So on to point 6, reception and influence. And really I'm going to break this one down, at least for today's video in this book, into 3 categories: religious importance, influence on literature, art, and culture, and interpretations or adaptations. So let's talk about religious importance first. And it affects the main 3 religions of this Abrahamic God, which are Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. For the Jews, this is it. This is the establishment of the covenant. This is the 10 Commandments. This is the tabernacle. This is everything. For Christians, it's taken as just a part of the redemption narrative, with parallels being drawn between Moses and Jesus. This is what Christianity has made its living off of, essentially, is taking the Old Testament and finding a way to tie it into the New Testament, to make everything that happened in the Old Testament about Christ, about the coming of Christ and what he would do. So when we see Moses freeing his people physically from slavery, this is an allusion to when we see Jesus metaphorically freeing us from our captivity of sin and death. These parallels are drawn all over, and it's pretty interesting, to say the least, and not get into a whole bucket of worms. Bucket of worms, is that a phrase? I don't know. Let's continue. Can of worms. In terms of its influence on culture, art, literature, and history, I mentioned before that this has really been taken on by the African American community. We see Martin Luther King Jr. referencing the Exodus story in his speeches and drawing on those parallels. We see Harriet Beecher Stowe in her novel Uncle Tom's Cabin, comparing the oppression of the Israelites and the plight of the African American slave. It has worked its way into music in this regard and into movies. The Ten Commandments was one of the first biblical narratives to really be done on a huge Hollywood level, bringing that story to mass audiences. And it's still being redone, with the newest one being just a few years old now. The Prince of Egypt is one of the best animated cartoons within any kind of religious ideology that's ever been presented. Again, it has served as an example and a story that has been taken and used by so many different groups over much of history. And then third, its interpretations and adaptations are many. And this is really looking at how it's used on a scholarly level. I hate to use Jordan Peterson as an example again, especially in terms of a scholarly level, but you can look at the work that he's doing right now on the Exodus story. This is something that has universal appeal. And like I mentioned earlier when talking about its themes, that you can just really pull apart for meaning and apply in many, many different ways, which again is something that Jordan B. Peterson is very, very good at. So again, some interpretations really focus on its theological importance and understanding the rule and the law as part of God's nature and character, that morality, that ethics. And some focus more on the physical and the reality of this story as a historical narrative showing the beginning of the oppression of the Jews, and specifically what the world has looked like since for this people group. We could say more here, but for sake of time, I think we're going to move on to our final point, Point 7, which is contradictions, errors, and misconceptions. This is always the hard one for me because I could go on forever. The atheist YouTuber in me wants to list this out line by line by line by line. I'm going to give you just a few. Let's talk about contradictions, or at best inconsistencies, first. One would be the Pharaoh's identity. This has been a huge issue and is not something that the Bible is clear on at all. There are chronological inconsistencies where in one spot the Bible lists very specifically 430 years and another 400, and it's not just giving an estimate or a rounding there, it's giving a precise number. Obviously, both of these things can't be true, but of course, you're going to be able to make a lot of excuses around these things and why we have different numbers and why the different source materials give us these different numbers, etc. Third is going to be numbers and measurements. We get all kinds of different numbers and measurements from how many people were with Pharaoh, how many soldiers he had, how many Egyptians there were at that time, how many Israelite slaves there were, how many made it in, how many made it out. Again, all of this looks really normal for what you expect out of a man-made book that is just compiling different sources from this oral tradition narrative that had been floating around for who knows how many centuries. It starts to look a little fuzzy when you say that it is divinely inspired in any way. Some Christians have a big problem with this. Some Christians see no problem with this and just excuse it as man writing the Bible, having a fallible nature, and seeing those inconsistencies is something that we would expect to see, but it doesn't take away from the story of what God did for these people, the covenant that he established, and the relationship that he wants to have with everyone because of it. I think that's a stretch. But today, my job is just to give you the different perspectives. Let's talk about errors and some historical inaccuracies. Again, I mentioned before, we already have a lack of historical evidence. From an archaeologist perspective, it is almost baffling that we don't have anything considering the narrative told in this biblical story. The Exodus event itself is in large question. Just being that this was a mass migration of such a large number of people for such a large number of time, and that they left essentially no imprint whatsoever on the world, this is very, very hard to fathom. We see far more from far less on a far shorter time scale in other historical events. Third would be root and locations. In terms of locations, we have descriptions that don't fit anything, names that have never been recorded in any other historical document or accounting. The route itself is unclear and at times is messy and contradicting with where they went and how they went. Even the fact that they arrived in Canaan outside of Egypt, when we know that at that time Canaan was actually a property of Egypt. So you didn't escape from Egypt into what? More Egypt. There would have been Egyptian rule there as well. Something the Bible completely leaves out and makes it sound like they just wandered into this perfect promised land filled with a few natives and giants that have to be conquered. This is something that the writers who were writing generations later wouldn't have known, but if it had actually happened at that time, would have been obvious to anyone who made that journey. And then some common misconceptions might be the Red Sea. There's thinking from certain perspectives that this could be the Reed Sea or the Sea of Reeds, which would really change the whole trajectory of, again, where they went through and how they ended up on what side, etc. Moses being the author is the biggest misconception, but we've covered that in pretty good detail. And another misconception out there is really how literal should we take these plagues? I've seen scientists who also happen to believe in the narrative of the Exodus story try to explain from a scientific level, well, if the water was poisoned in this capacity, it would have turned red because of all of the fish coming up in their blood, and that could actually lead to a breeding ground for locust, which could actually bring on an onslaught of frogs, and that could have done this to the grain that was served first to the firstborn, so all of the firstborns would have been poisoned, etc. And they've made a way for this to exist, and I think that it is reaching, to say the least, especially when compared with the actual events and the actual time frame established in the Exodus narrative about those plagues. But again, the idea of how literal they were, in what order, for how long that they lasted, yet alone certain aspects like the fact that many innocent firstborn Egyptians died. What does that say about this same God of morality that is giving these very specific laws about not harming and killing, but only to his people, the Israelites? Or the concept of free will that is up for debate when you start looking at how God hardened Pharaoh's heart so that he would say no, just so he could do more plagues and establish more of that magnificent divine power that he had. And knowing that that resulted in the death of so many innocent firstborn children of Egypt really paints that question of morality and free will to an even larger extent. And again, this is all just looking within Exodus. If you compare Exodus to what happens in other accounts, it gets even messier. A quick example of this is that in Exodus, we get a number of 600,000. However, later in Numbers, we get a different accounting of just the men that were eligible for military at over 605,000. With the time frame in between, these two numbers are highly problematic. Exodus is very unclear about what happens to Pharaoh and if he definitely dies. And the idea that we have that he does die when the Red Sea comes crashing back in on him and his people is actually found later in Psalms 136:15. Seems like an important detail that would have gotten covered in the Exodus narrative, and if not, it seems like a weird addition and almost boastful exaggeration when the psalmist is looking back on what happened previously. Again, there are so many things like this that when you put the whole Bible under a spotlight together, things just don't add up. And I could go on, literally hundreds of examples of misconceptions, errors, or inconsistencies/contradictions here. But let's wrap up with this. Exodus, however you split it, however real, imaginary, or mythical that it is one of the most important liberation stories in all of history. Its accounting of the Israelite nation as a people group is fundamental to the Jews still to this day. Its focus on ethics and morality, whether you agree with those ethics and morals or not, is still huge in understanding who this God of the Jews really was and what would have been important to him. With that said, that's really about it. I hope that you enjoyed this episode. I hope that you learned something new. Please let me know anything you'd like to add into the comments, whether it is a defense of something I said, whether it is another example of a contradiction. As much information as we can get in these videos about these particular books, I think will be a fascinating place for people to come and watch and then read and get a varied view of exactly what these books have meant to so many different people over such a large amassing of time. Thanks for watching. Have a wonderful day. And as always, keep thinking.